Good evening. Welcome to tonight's meeting, everybody. Tonight's meeting is the second of a series of presentations that's being made for us by Dr. Ranjeet Brar on the economics of capitalism. And this evening, the particular subject is, who are the working class? So I will pass over to Ranjeet in just a minute. But beforehand, I would like to congratulate George and Gayatri on the birth of their baby daughter, and also to say thank you to everybody who has been mobilised this weekend to support the NHS demonstrations. I will pass over to Ranjeet.
Good evening.
Can you Hi Ranjeet, could you hear me okay there?
I can hear you fine, yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, good. I've just made a short introduction there, but my laptop is still telling me that I'm muted, so I'm not sure whether that actually went out or not.
Everyone says they can hear you.
Great, okay,
I can hear you.
Perfect.
Can everyone hear me? Give a couple of waves if you can. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, look, pleasure to be with you. If anyone didn't hear Rob, he was firstly saying, I think we had a fantastic outing as the Workers' Party over the weekend on Saturday, supporting a lot of demonstrations up and down the country, where people were campaigning for increased paying conditions for the National Health Service, in particular the demand of nurses for a 15% pay increase. And I was very happy that so many people were able to get up and down around the country to support that important event. And the second thing was that George and Gayatri have happily had their third child together. So we send them our congratulations. We have found out it's a girl and she is called Oban. So that's fantastic news. Our party is called the Workers' Party. We make no bones about it. We're a party for the working people. Some people are confused even by the term workers. What does it mean to be a worker party? What about if I'm unemployed? What about if I'm retired? What if I'm a child? What if I'm at work? What if I'm at school and studying full time and not yet working? So there are a number of confusions that are arising in actually the working class, even about the very term worker. And perhaps for that reason, it's not redundant to revisit the question of actually what is the working class? Historically, where does it come from? And so that is really the essence of what we are talking about today. But in order to answer that question, you have to very briefly summarize quite a few aspects of human history. And it really comes from the study that we were talking last week of political economy, how politics interacted with economy, with the way in which mankind has to produce to live, and the way in which mankind has organized himself to live, that we can answer that question historically. And so perhaps we should start. I've again taken the liberty of preparing a little bit of a presentation, but because I had a very busy day at work, I'm afraid I didn't finish it. So you'll bear with me. At a certain point, I'm just going to give it up and I'm just going to talk to you, okay? But this is what we were going to discuss. So we're still really talking about the science of socialism, how society became capitalist, and really it's the same question as from where does the working class come from and what its historical mission is. And this was what we were talking about. We said would be a series of things that we were going to discuss. I wanted to make one small correction before we went on. Last time I said that The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was the only work, or the last work, important work, that the capitalist class had contributed to political economy. But it was pointed out to me that David Ricardo was actually slightly later. And David Ricardo in this work, which is his opus, as magnus opus, his major work on the principles of political economy and taxation, he actually went slightly further in laying bare the essence of where value comes from. And I'm not going to go on about it. We're going to come to that in a later meeting, but I'll just make that brief correction now. The question I want to start, and the place I want to start, is, have classes always existed? I mean, that with multiple choice questions, you can normally tell the answer just by the way in which they're phrased. And again, if we have a general approach to the phenomena of nature, can we say of anything Has it always existed? Will it always exist? Will it exist for all time? There's a nice little bit of poetry I stumbled across by Samuel Johnson. Year chases year, decay pursues decay, still drops some joy from withering life away. New forms arise and different views engage. So out of that which passes away, something new is also born. And there's a process and a cycle of change that I think we see reproduced in many ways in many things. I was looking for this graph of an element of something coming into being, existing and passing out of being, but it then itself giving rise to a new phase in development. And it was interesting. I thought I'd find it in the field of chemistry, and I could find some chemical graphs, because this is a phenomenon we see in so many places, things coming into being and passing out of being, from the universe itself and the Big Bang to life, to atoms, to reactions. And this, interestingly, is an idea that's been taken up by marketing, and they're talking about early technology and market products and market forces. But I want you just to bear this in mind. We think, have classes. Is human history, are human beings themselves different from all the rest of nature? We're encouraged.
If I could just butt in a second, I'm just very sorry, but I think you might need to just manage your screen sharing settings there. I'm not sure if it's broadcasting the slideshow that you want to show as a small thumbnail. And I think that you'll want that to take up the whole screen for the parts that you're pointing to it. Okay.
You can't see any of the presentation then?
I've got it as a small box in the top right-hand corner of my screen. It is broadcasting. Okay. Okay. I'm being told it's fine. Sorry. I just thought that there was a bit of an image.
Because you are a co-host, Rob.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm getting a
everyone's all right
downstairs.
with it.
It's fine. Yeah. I just thought people might not be able to see.
No, I think it's all right. All right, good. So we'll crack on. Okay, so things coming into being and passing out of being. And the answer is, okay, classes themselves as a phenomenon have not always existed. Society was not always composed of classes. And there's a very kind of seminal work by Lewis Henry Morgan. It's a work that's gone out of fashion, but many elements of it are now generally recognized as being true. And there's always contention and debate within all fields of learning, in anthropology included. And very often, particularly when you're studying something like class society, it's not just an open field where, you know, axioms can be admitted. 2 + 2 is 4 is generally an uncontroversial statement. Talking about human history, human evolution, human geology, certainly anthropology, these questions of classes arise, real current interests that exist in society. So I want you to take that as a caveat. Bear in mind that there are people who disagree with this, but this is generally accepted amongst socialist thinkers and many branches of academia. So classless society unquestionably has existed. The earliest epoch that Morgan identified, he talked about savagery. And by that, he meant a pre-civilization. I'll tell you what we mean by civilization as well. And really, we're talking about hunter-gathering type economies and societies. And if you think about it, this has been the majority of human experience. 98% of human existence on the planet has been pre-class society. So it's very much true to say that classes have not always existed. They've come into being, and we'll see how they've come into being, what purpose they've served. And therefore, it's perfectly reasonable to say that it's possible to envisage in a future, at the future time, the classes will pass out of being. And in particular, we're talking about the Paleolithic or the Stone Age era. And this is the nice thing. So this was created, this slide, by some climate change theorists. And I want you to just ignore that part. It's a slightly busy slide. At the top, it's talking about the last 12,000 years in that green bar, the last 12,000 years from animal domestication through to modern society. But if you look below that, and if you look at that long evolution of human history, so 500,000 years, Homo rhodesiensis. So if you talk about really modern man, probably has been around for less than 500,000 years. You keep on seeing variation according to new discoveries and the way those are interpreted, but certainly for 300,000 years modern man has been around, and the period of domestication of agriculture from which civilization arises is only 12,000 years of that. So it's absolutely clear that this period of primitive and tribal society accounts for the vast majority of human existence, all humans on the planet. And what can we say about those societies? Well, it was interesting to see that, particularly with the clash of civilizations, particularly as civilizations that advanced and more advanced class society came into contact with those who hadn't got that social differentiation. There were periods when there are written records of the study of different forms of civilization in different places. And Morgan was amongst those, and he in particular studied lives of the different peoples, the different native peoples of the Americas. And a lot of his study is drawn from that, but there are many other examples all around the world. And as I say, they're common to the whole of humanity. And they're characterized by a common struggle for existence, by common labor in obtaining food, that the individual felt themselves to be powerless against the tremendous forces of nature. So collaboration and cooperation has been the earliest feature of human civilization. But they worked in common and enjoyed the fruit of labor in common. There wasn't the basis to exploit others because they couldn't make anything from their labor. They needed to work together, and therefore they shared the fruit of their labor together. There was no inequality, but equally, productivity was low, technological development was low, and early socialists or the great socialist thinkers have thought of this or characterized this state of society as a primitive communism, the pre-class society, and in the long march of human history, this is by far the longest stage. There was no exploitation, no classes, no private property, and interestingly, therefore, no state. The state is a mechanism used by one class to suppress and subdue another class. So police, army, judiciary, prisons, many branches of state, particularly the army and the police that we think of, didn't exist, wasn't necessary in this early form of state. Equally, there was no private property in land. There was common ownership of land, and what tools there were also held in common. And land being held in common was something that has existed throughout civilized society for many different groups, including certain parts of the land which were held in common, the commons. And as we saw last week, it was the diggers rebelling against the fact that those common lands were being taken by the feudal class and the rising capitalist merchant class that led them into their particular conflict. But 12,000 years ago, the domestication of livestock and great advances in agriculture arose. They arose in the Fertile Crescent in China, and it caused the rapid increase in the size of the population who expanded east to west with the same foodstuffs and more slowly north to south. And there was an expansion at that point as well, because there was a land bridge into the Americas, and north to south spread throughout the Americas. And so it's on the basis of just this last 12,000 years that we have seen a whole variety of civilizations arise. And this is that area of Mesopotamia. There were other areas where farming arose, but this is generally recognized to be the first area. So between the Tigris and the Euphrates, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and spreading into Egypt, these were the very areas of civilization. So with the emergence of agriculture, the nomadic life of hunting and gathering, which had dominated existence, probably of modern man for 500,000 years, but the whole of human civilization went into decline. And there was a reason for that. There were certain advantages of this new domestication of agriculture, which was the regular supply of food for the people. And off the back of that, there became an increasing division of labor. Cattle raising became a specialist area of production, both within society, and some groups and tribes became specialized in raising cattle. And there became the basis then, with this division of labor, increasing division of labor, for exchanging goods. What I've made and what you've made, we concentrate on making different things, and we can exchange them. And it was off the back of that first division of labor that land started to increasingly be worked by a common group, a common ancient family or tribal group, and it was held as privately owned by a group and ultimately privately owned increasingly by individuals. So mankind improves his tools. Obviously his immediate aim in improving his tools is to secure some increase in productivity, to have better food, to have better conditions of life. But he doesn't realize that in so doing, he's remaking himself. Indeed, the evolution of man can be linked to his increasing laboring, but he revolutionizes the whole of social relations. And it was the technological advance arising from this first early cultivation and domestication that led to gradual changes within that old society. So slow changes at first that gradually accelerate and change the whole of society. And the obvious things that we all know about, the making of fire, a bow and arrow, spears, but later pottery, grain and cattle, we discussed, iron and writing. All of these things led to massive increases in relative productivity of labor, first accruing slowly and accelerating. And then as production becomes more and more abundant, as it's possible for one person to actually produce more than is necessary for himself or herself to consume within that old primitive tribal society, there becomes a surplus. And if then it's possible by working to create a surplus, then it becomes desirable to add more labor in order to produce more, to live off that surplus. So the possibility for a class society, and a class society meaning the emergence of a group, a special group in society who are free from labor, who can live off the labor of others. So one group, a stable group that arises that regularly lives off the labor of others becomes possible. And where can you find that labor power? Well, the early answer to that was through war. And while I've given you a relatively late example in there's a Roman battle going on there with a conquered adversary. And there were civil wars and Punic wars as well as the wars of empire. But war, captured enemies were no longer either killed or, as in a very early stage, even eaten, as we've seen in various cannibalistic societies. They were transformed into slaves, and slaves were used for all kinds of purpose to labor to create an additional surplus. So class society was born. And increasingly we see separate agriculture and artisanship, arts and crafts, raising items of metalwork, items of pottery. So specialization in labor. And with this, a rise and growth of inequality. So the distinction of rich and poor was added to that between free men and slaves. And we've seen also that then actually that private property fell to a class of individuals who wanted to pass it on to their children. And with that initial division of labor came the subjection of women also to men. It just so happened that that private property fell within the sphere of production of men. Prior to that, there had been egalitarianism in the early society between men and women. So some pictures there from ancient Egypt, but really the Bronze Age, born in the valleys of the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, as well as the Indus. So there were development of surplus foodstuffs, as we talked about, able to support a growing population, and the beginnings of large towns and even cities, ancient cities to arise. When we talk about the first 2,000 years of civilization, that's what the archaeologists call the Bronze Age, and what early socialist thinkers called the Asiatic mode of production that they saw in Egypt, China, Mesopotamia, and also the ancient societies of Greece, and Rome. We tend to think now about the ruling class, about a class that lives off the labor of another as an entirely negative phenomenon, as something entirely reprehensible, that's unjustified, that we want to do away with. And that reflects our own class interests now. But to what extent was that always the case? There's an angle from which you can say it was a relatively revolutionary transformation insofar as it freed a tiny privileged portion of the population from the burden of work, and they were therefore able to develop culture, science, and art. And, without this freeing of a portion of the population to learn, to study, we wouldn't have had any of the scientific advances that have enabled us to come to a higher stage now, where we can again put egalitarian aims on the order of the day. And this is an example of Archimedes. So Archimedes, we think of ancient Greece as being the birth of democracy. We're encouraged to think of it that way, but of course, Greek society was based upon slavery. It was an ancient slave society. And this is the quote from Archimedes when he discovered levers, when he discovered this force at the moment. Give me a place to stand a lever long enough, and I will move the world, which is a famous quote. So democracy, said Plato, is a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, and dispensing a sort of equality to equals and unequals alike. So lovely ideas of democracy, but as they debated, it was only the free men who debated. The majority of society were slaves. In Rome, as many as 1 in 3 of the population of Italy, or 1 in 5 across the entire area of the empire, were slaves. And upon that foundation of forced labor was built the entire edifice of the Roman state and society. And this is reflected in their ancient art. And this is a picture of a mosaic in which slaves are serving their masters, saving them wide and foon here. But slaves were literally, they were talking tools. They had no rights to raise a family, no legal status or individuality, and they couldn't create own property. So they were considered just like any other piece of property, a building, a chair, a vase. The only difference being they could speak. Cattle, in fact, were called semi-mute tools. A tool was a tool, and a slave was a talking tool. So everyone knows about the Roman Empire. The slave system was slightly more complex, and it began more gradations. But I just want to, emphasize that the fact that we all know about this slave, class society didn't always exist. Early civilization, as it came about on the basis of increased productivity and division of labor, was a class society. A class society was a new phenomenon, and this is self-evidently true that the entire Roman state and cultural apparatus was built on the exploitation of one part of the population to provide for the other part. Okay, that is an important conclusion that I want to think about. And that class society was riven with conflict from the beginning. It was inherent within the conflict within society. There were regular uprisings of the slaves who perhaps didn't have always the ability to think about how they were going to get to a different and more just state of society, but anyway would fight for their freedom, fight for better conditions. It was particularly the case that when there were lots of wars, there were lots of slaves, and the conditions of slaves were particularly bad. They were particularly expendable. They were in a great supply, and it was at such times often that they were uprising. And the examples of Eunice, and in particular Spartacus, that everyone knows about. And it's worth just, I'm not going to tell you this whole story of Spartacus, but it's worth just noting that Spartacus was a gladiator, so a slave who was going to provide entertainment by dying, essentially for entertainment, creating scenes for the satisfaction of the poorer, the plebeian Romans, which was great value to keeping them in check. It was a Thracian gladiator who had served in the Roman army, who rebelled along with other serfs, actually with other slaves, managed to raise an entire army, defeated 2 whole legitimate regular Roman army legions, and ultimately was finally put down, and he and many thousands of his supporters were crucified by the Romans as a sign that this uprising against the slave order was futile. So class society was characterized by intense conflict from the beginning and necessitated the creation of a state. And that was the Roman army was both an internal state and an external state. It was a combination of police force and army, both for suppression of the internal population and for further conquest, supplying flesh slaves. So the state arose with class society, and the Roman society, which we all know about, is a perfectly good example to illustrate this. Not many people are also aware that there was intense conflict between the plebeians and the patricians, the wealthy, biggest slave-owning classes. And there was even, I only learned this recently, a plebeian secession. And I learned it while looking for a particular quote of a Roman patrician who was justifying class society, which is very famous. And I learned this. So essentially, the plebeians were frustrated by their relative poverty. So poverty became an increasing feature of a large portion of even the free men of Rome. So there was a further degradation into different classes. And they actually tried to secede and actually left Rome and were talked into coming back by Menenius Agrippa, who was consul of Rome, so essentially the ruler, but the rulers rotated amongst the patrician class. Menenius told this story, and this is a story which is well known, a justification of class society, which essentially is still used today. He told the soldiers, so the free men who wanted to leave Rome because of their impoverishment, a fable about the parts of the human body, how each part had its own purpose in the greater function of the body. So he compared society to one individual organism. Be very careful of people who give you these analogies. He said, the rest of the body thought the stomach was getting a free ride, so the body decided to stop nourishing the stomach. Soon other parts became fatigued and unable to function, so they realized that the stomach did serve a purpose and they were nothing without it. So it's the job of the patrician class to eat and of the slave and plebeian class to work. So everyone has their place, everyone has their role in society. These are essentially still adaptations of this idea, which are used to justify class society. Now, at a certain point, you can say the Romans had far more justification for the organization of their society, given their technological level and their historical place. But these are still used today. Each of us has our place, each of us has our function. We must learn to just get on as we are, and society must be stable. So be passive, don't rebel, don't rise up. It's interesting to note. And while slavery had its place, whilst this society was a great advance upon, hunter-gatherer society, which by being beautifully egalitarian, many of you might have seen a movie, Dances with Wolves, you can be very romantic about the life of hunter-gatherer communities, but the level of production is very low, the level of technology is low, life expectancy is low. Slave society was an advance, but it was still very wasteful of human life. It imposed unbearable conditions and there were frequent revolts. And this, in its place, gave rise to, I think I run out of my prepared slides. So what I'm going to do is just switch. So out of this class society gave rise to a new form of society. So slave society was displaced. And can you still see me if I do that? Yeah, good. That's great. So slave society was displaced essentially by feudal society. And the whole of the Middle Ages, we were encouraged to think of Roman civilization as a golden age, and then there was a fall. It's the wrong way to think about history. There was an advance in productivity of labor, and out of slave society rose feudalism. And it was an advance precisely because actually slave labor was relatively unproductive. The slaves were in a bad way, if they didn't feel that they were being treated well, yes, they could be killed, but it didn't advance production. And equally, if they were wanting to, they could simply go slow, not work in a productive way. It wasn't in their interest to work, and therefore production was low. Feudalism came, there was a rise of new classes. Essentially, those classes were the feudal barons and the peasantry. Land remained the principal means of production, and natural economy, so economy for consumption, prevailed. Under this class, the ruling class, the lords, were able to still buy and sell serfs attached to the land, but couldn't kill them. And there was a general increase in exchange. And within that society, there was also fierce class struggle, many peasant revolts seen throughout Europe in the known history. Wat Tyler is one that we can think of in our own history. And also, as there's an increase in division of labor, there was a rise of the townsfolk, the third estate of burghers, who became the bourgeoisie, who gave rise ultimately to the capitalist class, the artisans producing for exchange and for the market. So this gradual rise in exchange, the gradual rise of the merchant class, at first peripheral became increasingly central, and we then started to see increasingly the phenomenon of money. Wherever things were exchanged between tribes and within societies, that which was most often exchanged, first of all, served as money, often cattle in primitive societies, before gradually the rise of precious metals. And still, natural production, so predominantly production to consume. The early peasant households produced the vast majority of what they needed themselves to eat as well as to wear. They produced clothes, they produced leather, they wove materials. So, it was only with the rise of artisanship and the rise of an increasing number of people involved in trade that this was gradually changed. But even at the birth of capitalist society, when the rising merchants had become so important, had amassed such wealth that they were expanding their market, finding new territories, and expanding their production. Even at the beginning of that era, we think of the Elizabethan era as being that time in England, and the rise of wool merchants, and the gradual rise of the merchant class who came to seek political power, as we touched upon last week. Even at that time, initially, the vast majority of goods were produced locally and consumed locally. They weren't for a general market. And yet that gradual development of exchange and the rise of the merchant class, the early usurer capital and the development of mercantile capital undermine the foundations of the old society. And you only have to think that, mankind basically has been producing the same things in terms of food, clothing, and shelter for many thousands of years. But the way in which we produce it and the increasing productivity of labor totally changed the organization of society. If you think of the shoes produced by the petty artisan, he has his own tools, works his own. I don't know if you've seen the book, The Tailor of Gloucester. Imagine a tailor or an artisan using his own labor, his own wealth to buy raw materials, working up himself and selling it at a slightly increased amount. So he was using his own labor, but he's a small owner. If you compare that to the huge production of capitalists today, where one shoe factory can essentially produce enough shoes to put on the feet of an entire nation, and does so with hired labor, the hired labor not owning the plant and machinery. You can see the huge difference there is between the old classes and the way they produced and the modern capitalist class. So under the old conditions, almost all the wealth was produced by small-scale husbandmen who constituted the overwhelming majority of the population. The population lived settled down in the villages, producing the greater part of their products for immediate use or for the markets of local settlements. Gradually, they were displaced. So with the liberation of the serfs were freed from the land. They were freed from the land was a double-edged sword. With the liberation of the serf from the land, the life of the people underwent a complete change. Instead of small-scale artisans' shops, we've seen the birth of large factories, which grew very rapidly, pushing out small-scale handicraftsmen, turning them into wage laborers and compelling thousands of workmen to work together, producing tremendous quantities of commodities which are sold all over the internal market in Britain or France or Russia, and increasingly the rising of a world market. So small-scale production replaced by large-scale production. And everywhere, the masses of workmen were becoming simply hired men working for wages. So at one end of the scale, people were freed. They could leave the land and were no longer tied to land, so they were free. But equally, they were freed of the means of production. They had nothing to sell but their labor power. So that, on the other hand, there became people who owned the means of production, owned workshops, owned raw materials, owned lots of money to pay wages, who could put those workers to work. So they purchase massive materials and pocket the profits of this mass production by the capitalist class. Production has become then capitalist, and it presses relentlessly and mercilessly upon the small husbandmen, destroying their settled life in the village, compelling them to wander over the country from end to end as simple laborers selling their labor to capital. and ever greater and greater portions of the population were torn away from the villages to form from agriculture to collect in the cities. And this is a phenomenon we're still seeing today, an increasing growth or an urbanization of the world's population, still actually oversupply in many countries of human beings who are dependent on small plots of land and live in great poverty as a result, because their labor is extremely unproductive and they can barely produce enough to eat. But the possibility arising of actually hugely increased output and production. So while there are phenomena of starvation, while there are phenomena of poverty in the world, out of this process, out of this birth of the modern working class at one pole and the capitalists at the other, what we have gained from the process is huge increase in productivity of labor. And so with the birth of the working class, even though we are dispossessed, we have also been given a great gift of collective labor. Working together is tremendously powerful. We talked last week that all of our means of production, the way in which we all work essentially is social. And it gives the ability to reorganize society, to reconstitute society on a new basis. And it was out of this desire, this feeling that the working class were creating all wealth, and yet we're deprived of wealth. George has been asking you to read, I hope you have, The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, and we're going to come on to some of the concrete economic means, the actual way in which that money is accrued by the capitalist, the extent to which we can say the working class are genuinely robbed by the capitalist. But it's enough to note at first that class society didn't always exist. Through the process of increased productivity of labor, classes came to exist, and they've gone historically through a number of changes. But each revolution, from the slave society to the feudal, from the feudal to the capitalist, and there were a series of revolutions that characterize our history, each of them actually perfected civilization, perfected the state, carried on being the rule of a tiny elite over the vast majority. And while everyone recognized there was an exploiting class and an exploited class in ancient Roman society or in feudal society, this is not in the news every day. It's not generally recognized that we live in a world today which is characterized by wage slavery, by an exploiting class of capitalists and the vast majority, the exploited class of laborers. And yes, there are many gradations between us, the relatively wealthy and the relatively poor. But if you look at distribution, we can see that wealth has come to rest in a tiny number of hands, and they do represent a real ruling class who really make decisions about production, decisions about policy on our local level, on our national level, on international level. If we feel that we want to protest against war because it's wrong, and 5% of the population of Britain turn up on the street to say that war is wrong, we don't want it, and yet it happens anyway, is because there is a real class, a ruling class, who actually exercise power despite all forms of democracy. We are not in control of that class. They are very much in control of production, in control of wealth, and therefore pull the levers of power. And this is the key message. We still live in a class society. The classes haven't always existed. They will not always exist. And our demand to reorganize society on a just footing, putting the vast majority of workers on the basis of our increased labor, on our increased ability to produce the wherewithal for all humanity, that we can abolish poverty, abolish class society, and actually build an egalitarian society where people are free to work, participate in work, but also participate in the running of society and have adequate leisure time, is absolutely just. And it's the historical outcome of the whole long march of civilization. And it's the study of political economy in particular, and precisely that leads us to the justification for us to know exactly why that is the outcome of history, that this is not purely a utopian dream that we can have a better society. This is the basis of getting rid of the contradictions that are holding society back and building a new egalitarian order. So I'm sorry I couldn't complete my presentation in time. That was the essence of what I wanted to say today about how we've ended up with a situation where we have a working class who make up the vast majority of humanity, well over 99% of humanity, who are dispossessed of the means of production, and a tiny capitalist class. And in the future couple of meetings, we're going to talk about the mechanisms by which they exploit us and by which we feed them with our labor. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks very much, Ranjeet. That was a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed that. Fran, I'm going to come to you first because you sent me a message that you had a question. Let me just find you on the...
Evening all. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, definitely.
Well, that were fantastic. But I've just got a quick question. I was just wondering why, how Marxism fits into this, what you were just saying, and why the ruling classes are so scared of just like a quick theory of bringing all that back together. What scares them so much, if you can sort of bring that back towards Marxism? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes. Shall I? It's all right to answer that, Rob. Yeah, well, that makes perfect sense. So I think everything that I'm saying is Marxism. Okay, so if I've not broken it down into the quotes, if I've not given you chapter and verse from theoretical textbooks, that is not because they don't exist. They absolutely do. It's certainly not because I haven't read them. I absolutely have. And it's not because I wouldn't recommend other people to read them. I'm trying to keep the lectures as broad as possible, simply in order to outline the basic concepts. But I think anyone who has read Marx, if you've read Capital, if you've read Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State, if you've read Engels, The Role of Labor in Transition from Ape to Man, if you've read Engels, the condition of the working class in England, if you read Marx's teaching on the state, whether that's Louis, the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, or I could name many texts, and not only Marx, but also the great disciples of Marx who have expanded on this work, and we can talk about the experience of real socialist societies. But my point is that these are real phenomena that have existed, that are based on human society and an observation. So I'm trying to give you the logical basis of what really is the essence of scientific socialism, which I don't really distinguish from Marxism. Marxism is scientific socialism, and I think it draws upon, and you know, those who understand or acquainted with Marx and Engels will realize that they were great polymaths. They were people who spoke 10, 11, 12 languages, who studied the whole of ancient primitive civilization and culture, who kind of read Latin and Greek as well as Russian and Arabic, and you know, they really had the whole of world culture as it existed then at their fingertips. They thought very deeply, they explored philosophy. So it was through the development of political economy, through the understanding of the way society has changed, through studying historical processes, that they arrived at this great teaching. But I think that teaching doesn't have to be just explained in those terms. I'm afraid to say that people have been tremendously put off the concept of Marxism, and even those who call themselves Marxist are very often not familiar with these terms. So I'm really happy in this series just to refer to it as really the science of socialism, as scientific socialism, and talk about really the basis of really, this is human civilization and culture. It's what drives human and civilization and culture forward. It's the basis of the society that we see now, because we're encouraged to think of things in fixed, frozen ways, like it, thus it has been and thus it ever will be. But if you think about, for example, Darwin and Darwinism, it was generally the prevalent dogma 500 years ago that if there was this kind of bird, it had always been that kind of bird, that God had put it there, that it served a certain niche in God's great plan, and that was it. That was the beginning and end. It hadn't come into being, it wasn't going to go out of being. But Darwin discovered through many different observations, but famously looking at the finches of Galapagos, of their adaptive radiation, he realizes one finch spread to different islands, living in different habitats, had evolved to be different. So that there was a process of evolutionary change. And what scientific socialism is looking at the process of evolutionary change over the much shorter period of human history and civilization, and saying this is really something that can be studied like anything else, something that follows laws like anything else. And he went on to think about what was driving, you know, society and civilization. Was it geography? Well, no, because it's a different time scale. Was it climate change? No, it's a different time scale. So he said, actually, it's economics. It's economics that drives human society forward. It's economics. And that really just meant the way in which mankind cooperated, the way in which mankind developed technology, and the fact that while he did it just in order to, you know, while we did it to create more to live better lives, at a certain point, that certain revolutions in productivity of labor led to total reorganizations of our society, and that led us through history. But that isn't a process that has stopped. You know, everyone looks back and they look at the Stone Age and say, well, that was the Stone Age, and we're happy to talk about it because they had stone tools. So it was the tools that defined the society. That was the Bronze Age. We're happy to talk about it. The tools defined the society. The Iron Age, the tools divided the society. Even feudalism, you know, you can talk about the technology and the class structure that defined the society. But we're not encouraged to think of this as a continuously evolving process that resulted in capitalism, capitalism being an exploitative society, and the class struggle still going on being the thing that's driving us forward, and the righteous and just anger of the workers are being marginalized and impoverished all over the world, and creating a very unstable society that we live in, being the continuation of that entire historical process. The society ceases to be a bunch of accidents, but actually it's what's driving us forward, and it's the justification and the historical reasons why our struggle is so vibrant, why it's, you know, not just a dream, but it's something that was almost inevitably needs to happen if we're to solve the problems of society. And it's the same historical process. Our struggle is the continuation of the historical march of humanity, because constantly the capitalists, as we saw yesterday, are trying to put forward the ideology that history has ended. Class society, is it? Capitalist society, is it? Francis Fukuyama, when the Soviet Union fell, actually produced a book, said, the end of history. Western liberal democracy, i.e. capitalism, is the end of history. That's it, get used to it. And we have to revisit these ideas and prove again and again with modern discovery and modern understanding that that is incorrect and that socialism is justified and a new society is possible. That was a long answer. I'm sorry, Frank.
Thanks very much, Ranjeet. No, that's a good answer. I was just I'd like to just make a point quickly in relation to what you'd spoken about there with the development from egalitarian kind of primitive society to hunter-gatherer, or, you know, early sort of agricultural societies that were developing into classes. And, you know, this is something that I'm aware that I never came across that as a theory through my conventional education. It wasn't something that was focused on or explained through schooling. It was something that I only really came to understand when I came across reading some text of Engels, where he's referencing the anthropologist that you mentioned, Lewis Morgan. But I came across a while ago something that is really interesting on this point. Some of you might be familiar with this guy. He's sort of a celebrity sort of anthropologist, I guess, called Bruce Parry, who's, you know, he's famous for making these documentaries where he goes and lives with, you know, primitive tribes living in the Amazon rainforest, or, you know, various places around the world, and gets a kind of insight into their sort of cultural, you know, sort of ways of being. And I came across this interview with him, which you can find it on YouTube. It's on I think it's a program that's called Renegade Incorporated, or Renegade Inc. That was like an old sort of RT documentary, I think. And anyway, he was being interviewed at this festival or something, you know, an ideas festival. And he described how, you know, over his life doing this work, going with, you know, living with these different societies and tribes, that he was, you know, become very familiar with all the kind of different ways that these different cultures might exist in their own particular environment. And he got used to this sort of stepping from living in 21st century urban life when he was, you know, not off filming doing his job, and then living in these, you know, primitive kind of, you know, societies in small groups in the jungle. And he described how after doing this for so long, you know, part of his life, he had an opportunity and went and stayed with a tribe that were actually operating on this pre-class structure, egalitarian, primitive basis. I can't remember where it was specifically. It was I think it was somewhere in the, you know, deep in the sort of Amazonian interior. But I'd have to sort of check on that. But he basically described how after going to this one society and staying with them, that suddenly he became aware that it was distinctly different from all the other ones that he'd stayed with, and that he felt that in his mind it all kind of reordered, and that he naturally began to think of all the other primitive societies that he'd stayed with as being part of our sort of modern culture and society in the way that they were divided up, and understood it to be distinctly different from this one experience that he'd had in a what he described as a sort of truly egalitarian way. And it's interesting because he's not come at this from a, you know, he's no sort of student of Marxism or anything. And I think in that interview he even, you know, sort of says, I'm not like a really sort of academic kind of, you know, philosopher, or, you know, like you know, he's not got the experience with all these kind of things. And, you know, he did say within that he thought it was something that was not that you know, anthropologists and philosophers were not aware of until very recently. But it struck me as quite an interesting thing that here was this guy who had basically come to this conclusion, because he goes on to describe how that had actually inspired him to sort of realize that humanity as a whole must actually be capable of solving all the problems that we face in the 21st century, because he'd actually experienced kind of really cooperative, you know, way of being with this particular tribe. And, you know, he'd come at that just from his own angle, but basically drew those same conclusions. It's quite an interesting interview if anyone wanted to look it up. Yeah, but that's all I will say for now, and I will come to Claire.
Hi, is that on?
Hi, Claire.
Hi. Ranjeet, when you were showing your slides and we got the clever guys in Greece, and you can kind of get a feel for where eugenics comes from and where the underpinning of a superiority of the upper classes comes from, because it's like, you know, how did these people manage to rise to the top, and how did they manage to develop themselves intellectually and educationally? That wouldn't be a route I'd want to go down, but I can see how that's happened. And when you talk about a modern understanding of where we can go to next, and we look at our program, the key for me is the lifelong education, because education is elitist and very much tied into producing things and being a producer. I mean, I suppose it's on the old factory model. It may vary slightly. When I went to university, you got a grant. You were allowed to fail and still got the grant the next term. You had time to explore. And I personally was brought up in my family, which was thoroughly working class, education for education's sake, which I'm enormously grateful for. It was never about it probably was on the periphery about getting a decent job and being secure financially, no problem with that. But I know the core was education for education's sake, that life is bigger than my dad had experienced in a factory. And it's like, you've got this chance. And of course, that's I think that's possibly the last generation where we had a better life maybe than our parents, because since then I think it's actually deteriorated, and you can't take that for granted, because now you are in debt and you're a wage slave. You've got a big car, you've got a nice flat maybe, but you are totally encumbered by debt, big debt. What, you know, that's, as Tony Benn said, you know, that's going to keep you in your place, isn't it? You're not going to want to challenge your employer if you've got that level of debt. And that's what we see, that fear of losing your job, that fear. I teach, and there's still a fear there of saying the wrong thing, because, you know, everyone's got a massive mortgage, and, you know, you get tied into that, don't you, so easily. But I think one of the ways out is what we say. this idea of lifelong education, lifelong learning, because I don't want the ideas to come from the elite. You know, those guys with the curly hair who they made statues of. I'm not knocking Socrates, obviously a very bright guy, but there's more than that, isn't there? You've got to listen to everyone. And I think that's in our program. At least I hope it is. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks very much. Have you got anything that you'd like to add there, Ranjeet?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Thanks, Rob. Both of those really interesting and valid points, I thought. Rob, on your first chat, I would just note that Lewis Morgan. So it is, I think it's true to say that Marx offered to dedicate capital to Darwin on the basis that he thought his revolutionary understanding of the development of species contributed to mankind's understanding of change. And particularly a dialectical work, and it fit with his philosophical conception of nature. And he also, when he read Morgan, Lewis H. Morgan, who had spent time with tribal societies at different rates of development, Morgan, on the basis of his experience of primitive communism, of just how at peace people were with each other, how well man lived with each other spiritually, though technologically backward, though hard lives, you know, he saw very much that it was possible on the basis of cooperation from his study to build a new kind of society, to get rid of the state, to think about egalitarian society. So he also came up with very revolutionary conclusions, very similar to Marx from his own independent study of primitive society. So I think that is a common feature, you know, of in-depth study of human society. And I think that's really interesting. Claire, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I don't want you to think that I am holding up. These terms are very loaded now. If you say primitive, I'm talking about the whole of mankind's evolution. So I'm just simply speaking about historically ancient societies, and from the ancient to the modern. It doesn't imply, and equally, this is the common heritage of man in every corner of the globe. There's no part of man's society that hasn't gone through these stages at different times and different places. It's very interesting to talk about eugenics, because there's a book, and I did put it up there, by Jared Diamond, who is a modern anthropologist, if you like, relatively modern. He's quite old now, called Guns, Germs and Steel. And I really think you would find that fascinating and interesting. It is very much along the lines, doesn't ever say anywhere in it that it's a work of scientific socialism. I haven't been able to deal with the whole of human history. I'm just sketching an outline from known facts to show a general line of development of society that we've gone through on our long march towards what I think we're aiming towards, which is a higher state of civilization, which will always also be based on egalitarian relations between man and woman, all societies, all nations, based upon working in common and utilizing the high level of technology. I think that's what scientific socialism and communism aim towards, a higher state of socialism. But he talked more about colonialism. So the question he asked, he said he went to Papua New Guinea after World War II, and he met there people who were incredibly intelligent, incredibly bright, whose memory and kind of social skills and charisma were much higher than his. And this Papua New Guinean asked him, he said, how come you have all of the cargo? And by that he meant, Papua New Guinea had relatively, I guess it would have fitted with almost a Stone Age level civilization by the point of view of development of all societies. And it had received technology from the outside along with the process of colonization, which was clearly a process that when you study it, again, if you look at something like Howard Zinn's People, History of America, and you want to see the study of colonialism, the United States was built upon genocide, about the treatment meted out from those who had guns in a class society towards those who didn't have guns, germs and steel. My fundamental point is not just that these things happen, that they're reprehensible, but they're historical facts. And the question is, how did they happen? How did one, you have to view the whole of human history as one whole. And that comes out of this as you were saying, of a kind of lifelong learning and a gradually increasing appreciation. So it's not pejorative to say one part advances, one part falls behind. Not every part of humanity at any stage can be in the forefront of scientific culture and development. You know, when African civilization was at its peak, you could say in Europe they were still climbing trees. People do say that, and you know, so different parts of human society and civilization surge ahead at different times, and that's a common phenomenon. But the question as to why one part of civilization surged ahead is very much connected with this 12,000 years ago, the sudden domestication of livestock and of really finding stable sources of agriculture. And it was the base of that new life that led to a sudden explosion in population, greater density, towns coming along, towns where you live side by side with animals, infections and plagues being common, just as we're seeing a mass infection throughout humanity now. This has been a periodical feature of society that was class society, living in big towns side by side with animals. And therefore a certain immunity was built up amongst the population, so that when people from the New World, or rather from the Old World, from Europe, went to the New World, not only did they have a higher technology in terms of weaponry, that just meant that they didn't fight on the same level. You know, you can read the stories of the massacres of the Incan and the Mayan people. They're horrendous, but they show you it just wasn't an equal battle because there were different levels of technological development. And equally, they had an immunity to all kinds of viral and bacterial agents that had never been witnessed by those populations. And so that genocide came about because of these different, you know, the different march of these technological innovations at different times. So, you know, Jared Diamond wrote that book to explain why did one part have the cargo. There was no difference, there was no racial or genetic difference in capabilities between one section of man and another. So the answer to those questions were historical. Why did one section of humanity come to advance and one decline? How has society gone through all these stages and developed? So it was the study of political economy, the study of human history as a whole, not to justify the exploitation of man by man, but to understand it, to say, how can we build a better society? And actually, talking of lifelong education, if you look at the, you know, early revolution, you go back 100 years and see what were the revolutionaries doing? What were they doing on Red Clineside? You know, what was John McLean doing? If you've ever read his book, The Rapids of Revolution, they were precisely giving these kind of talks, these kind of lectures to working people in factories. There wasn't at that stage a state which had, or the ability to pursue education to all levels. But absolutely, the working people realized that the heights of knowledge had to be scaled by the freedom seeker, that if they were going to be free, they had to educate themselves to the point that they were capable of being the ruling class. That means they had to have answers to every question. They had to have answer to the question, has their class society always been there? Will it always be there? Is our society justified? Is this the end of history? Is our movement justified? Can we build another world? So I think, as you say, I think lifelong education is part of our program. I think it's incredibly important. I think it's a traditional of the socialist movement, including the socialist movement in this country, not just Russian revolutionaries, though they also went off and taught factory workers the essence of human civilization and culture. It was socialists and revolutionaries who have had a historic role in bringing literacy to the populations who previously had no literacy. So at every stage, the socialist movement is a movement for enlightenment, to enlighten the masses, to say that the working people can do away with class society is to say we need to build a better working class. We need to constantly educate our working class. We need to educate ourselves and them to realize that we're the ruling class in waiting and we're capable of building a better society. And as you say, we need to understand all knowledge, but the system for understanding the knowledge is so important. You know, I've seen people who go on their gap years and they go to class-riven societies and they go to India and they just say it's backward and it's smelly and it's dirty and they get a feeling of superiority. They don't go with the tools to appreciate what they're seeing or to take the message, you know, that impoverishment is wrong and they should fight against it. They go, they see it, they go back to their normal lives, they've had their holiday. So it's actually our job is to give not only general understanding, but in particular class education, class understanding, and understanding of human history, civilization, and culture. So I absolutely agree with what both of you are saying. It's the bottom line.
Thanks very much, Ranjeet. Lionel made a point earlier in the chat about the origin of the word proletarian and that it's something that comes from the Roman society. But I see he's got a further sort of question on that and relating to Spartacus. So I'm just going to ask Lionel if you can put that question forward.
Great stuff. Yeah, thanks. So because you touched, Ranjeet, on the history of the whole class struggle, and especially you dealt with Roman society, slave society, and there's a really helpful newspaper out called Proletarian that we actually subscribe to today. There's a long time from Proletarian that we use to help to educate ourselves and workers today in the way they're exploited, and the proletarian classes of the Roman period. And just quickly before you answer that question, you're going to go in, or we're going to go into the technicalities of how the mechanisms of exploitation works. And I just want to say something very, very quickly. Honestly, I won't be more than a minute, or maybe 30 seconds. But basically, it's unpaid labor and surplus labor. You mentioned surplus labor. Because the slave gets no money at all, it appears that they are exploited for the whole period in which they are owned and put to work by the slave master. The modern slave, the wage slave, our wage slaves, we as wage slaves, because we're paid, the whole question of the exploitation and the surplus product, the unpaid labor that we do is hidden in the money form. So I'd just like you to say something about that, Ranjeet, if you could.
Thanks, Lionel. Ranjeet, would you have you got a response there?
Just that I agree. I mean, Lionel, thank you so much. Lovely to see you. And yeah, no, you know, I don't want to totally prejudge the next couple of meetings that we're having. I think you touched upon it very nicely. I agree with everything you said. I mean, a proletarian is a word that itself is confusing. We've deliberately called ourselves the Workers' Party, and yet even to call yourself the Workers' Party, which I think everyone will understand, people get confused about. As I said in the beginning, not everyone identifies themselves as a worker if they're retired. They don't understand that there's general class. We're talking about a class of people who don't own the means of production, who as a class, as their family groups and extended groups, have to go and work. It's literally just that. So they have to sell their ability to work to someone who can employ them and give them wages. If you're basically in that position, you're basically a worker, and proletarian is the most revolutionary section of the working class, if you like, who literally are in the position where they have least to gain from the maintenance of this order. And there's an increasing mass of people who are desperately impoverished in our world. And I touched on some of those figures the first time round. But, you know, the thing that I always like to say is 6 billionaires have the same amount of money as half the world's population. Environmental problems, deforestation. If you live in the outskirts of the Sahara and you're struggling to put food on your table and to heat water, you don't have the choice to make. Should you live sustainably, you're going to cut down whatever tree you can find locally, use whatever wood you can find locally to burn it for your fuel. If you are told that by putting mercury into a river, you can pan for gold and come up with a few little bits of gold and sell them. Unproductive a technique as it is, destructive to the environment as it is, it's your poverty that forces you to degrade the environment. It's a mass of people who are unable to plan their existence that degrades the environment. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's massive corporations who only can think about their next quarterly balance sheet, who degrade the environment. So this separation into two great classes of propertyless, who are powerless, no matter how much we understand the problems of the world and can give a rational solution to them, we're powerless to affect them. Our own government in this coronavirus crisis are powerless. They're the agents of the ruling class and the wealthy, but they actually don't own things. They can't move around production. They can't totally reinvent the NHS to deal with things. They're on a pathway of service to the ruling class who own everything. So the ruling class have to voluntarily give up their wealth under this, in order to solve problems. They don't do it. The ruling class can only think about augmentation of capital, or they cease to be capitalists because they'll go out of business by competition. So the capitalists can't solve the problems. The workers can't solve the problems. We've got two classes who, under the current order of society, give rise to all of the problems we face in modern society. So it's this proletarianization is increasing, the generation of masses, billions of people who are too poor to feed and clothe themselves, let alone to solve the problems of the world. This is the problem we're facing. This is why we need a radical reorganization of society.
Thanks, Ranjeet. Yeah. I've got a question from Jeff here. I'm just going to see if Jeff can unmute himself.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, excellent. Quite on the left about the emergence of capitalism and how that had a revolutionary emergence into the world. But I was quite interested also, just incidentally, about how the old classical world emerged into feudalism. The empire overstretched and then decentralized, and then feudalism comes out of this. But I wonder if there was any revolt by slaves that boosted their position in society. I wonder if there was any events, maybe like around the time of Justinian, if you know when that was, in the 500s, and that kind of thing. I've been researching a little bit about this. Yeah, that's at about 500s when everything really started to collapse, at least in Europe, and then through this fracturization and battle for lands, there was an agreement between peasants and the lords that the lords would protect them while the peasants would provide themselves with food and provide the lord with the food as well. And I just wondered, if there was any particular moment in time or certain events that happened that are written in history and that we know about that I haven't heard about yet, because I keep watching bourgeois things. Yeah, that's that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I don't think I could pull up anything particularly. You sound like you're quite well read on that to me. Ranjeet, could you pinpoint a precise point of the transition from a slave society to feudalism?
No, so I don't think there is thank you. First of all, I thought that was a very erudite little addition. It was very, very interesting. So certainly there was that period of split from the East and the West in the Roman Empire. The pressures on the Roman Empire were internal, from this overdependence on slaves, from the impoverishment of the plebeians, from the class struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. That was constant, but also they were constantly being harassed by their constant needs for slaves meant that they were constantly having to expand. It was one of that similar phenomenon happened to the slaving societies of the capitalist slavery in South America. They constantly needed to expand, to gain more slaves, to maintain their order, to maintain their society. So it was kind of inherently became unstable the bigger it got. And then they were harassed by other peoples that essentially took advantage of their weakness. And then there was, of course, constant struggles between the different between the different patrician sections. So, I mean, ultimately, the Eastern Roman Empire gave rise to essentially a feudal monarchical system, very much like the others. And the Western Roman Empire had a whole period when it had to go over to Christianity, that the emperors were converted because the army were converted, the rise of the new Christian religion, faith and teaching, but all of it was connected to the gradual transition to this new form of exploitation, which was basically the gradual increase in productivity of labor, and the fact that Roman slave labor was very unproductive and it couldn't extend beyond a certain point But history doesn't move exactly as like this was the moment when everything switched, any more than we can say the switch between capitalism and socialism. This was the moment when everything switched. There are key dates when kind of revolutionary transitions happened, but history kind of moves in zigzags. But there's a general pressure and direction of travel along the course that we've outlined, and I've just really picked points to illustrate rather than giving you, of course, I couldn't claim to give you an entire sketch of the whole of human history. No one really can. But what I like to point out is this conceptual framework for understanding the transition of different class societies on the long march. And within that, the more you learn about any different society, the more you can understand by putting it within that structure. If you look at Christopher Hill's work, and I kind of very mentions work on Oliver Cromwell, the kind of understanding of the Cromwellian Revolution, the English Revolution, the English Civil War, in the light of those new classes that were contending for power, sheds light on it. But without that, the study of history becomes just like an agglomeration of accidents of kings prancing about on horses, waving their swords around. You don't get any sense of real understanding of what the motive force of history is, what the motive driving force of human development is. And what the great socialist thinkers realized is that study of ancient history and the study of economics coalesced in an understanding of the class forces that were driving our own society forward. They look static. It's not. It's driving forward towards change. And that led them to understand, actually, that it's possible to build a new society based on this high development of productivity and working in common and abolition of class society, and that these egalitarian aims at the heart of socialist movement were actually the product of a long march of history.
Thanks, Ranjeet. Yeah, our deputy leader Jyoti has just added something in the chat there, just elaborating on that, what you were saying there. Really, in response, there was pressure from developments in farming technology, which, as Ranjeet referred to, required a more motivated worker to operate it, the different types of ploughs, etc. So, yeah, there are many interesting sort of avenues to go around when looking at these things. I found out, for instance, that when I was doing some research once, that the reason why you have all these kind of like Lord of the Manor things in dotted over the British Isles and I presume lots of parts of Europe, isn't just the sort of fact that you had Lords of the Manor that wanted to be, or kings that had wanted to have different castles and manor houses and things like that. But within the old kind of regions of the kingdoms of England, the kind of the intake that a monarch or a local sort of ruler would have with their entourage would be such that they would need to move to a different part of their realm, like throughout the seasons of the year, because they were relying on the people of each area to actually gather in enough kind of surplus harvest and goods that they'd be able to sort of go there and stay pigging out for an extended period. But they would have to up sticks and go to another one because it would all run out and they wouldn't be able to come back there until another year's time and hopefully had a good harvest. So there's lots of interesting things like this to ponder on in this historical sense. Hells, you've got a question.
Oh, thanks, Rob. It's a very slow march, Ranjeet, towards socialism. We're going to try and speed it up, aren't we, in the Workers' Party, comrades? But, in a society where you're seen as something really radical by wanting free healthcare and free education and better pay and conditions and things, I mean, we've all seen what happened to Jeremy Corbyn for just wanting such things as that. I don't think he was all that radical. But we're going to have to turn, we've all on to go back 40 years. Never mind marching towards socialism. We need to, go back to where we were just 40 years ago when we had free education and rights. And we've all on to do that, haven't we? We need to go backwards before we can go forwards. it's a very sad state of affairs. But you know, the conversation seems to be about anything but class. You know, it's about racial issues or politically correct things, or you know, there's all this propaganda and distraction for people. You know, you're supposed to be interested in anything except politics. You know, the royal family or this scandal, or you know, football, beer for the working classes. You know, that's all we're supposed to be interested in, isn't it? How do we get, Ranjeet or Rob, anyone in fact, how do we steer the conversation round to the class struggle in society? Thank you.
Thanks, Hills. I don't think it's a new question. It's an old question. So, you know, was it James Connolly who said, our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth. You know, so the concept that we're asking for something free is not right. We don't want anything free. We demand the right to work. It's through our work that all wealth is produced. And that means all the wealth that's in the hands of the very, very wealthy is not theirs, it's ours. All right. And we're gonna maybe touch on the economic reasons why that's really true over the next couple of meetings. But it really is ours. So we're not asking for a free ride. We're not asking for something that's not ours. We're saying we work hard. We all want the right to work hard to contribute to society on the basis of our cooperative labor. We'll create for the common good a decent standard of life for all of humanity. It's really, you know, it's not a very radical demand. It's so obvious. And if we had to go back 40 years and say how we managed to have so much more then, the answer is we had it more because we had a much more class-conscious population here and internationally. The working class, they knew they were working class. You wouldn't have to explain to them that what a worker is. They were much more likely to understand scientific socialism here and across the world. There were whole countries where that don't exist today, sadly, and there are reasons why that happened, but we shouldn't be demoralized by them, where the workers had done away with exploitation of man by man and had created a totally different society. And in our particular society, in Britain, in the United States, in the European Union countries, which didn't have a revolution, it was an accident of history that we didn't have a revolution. You know, the countries which became socialist and the countries that stayed capitalist was basically settled by the question of where the Red Army met the United States Army and the British Army at the end of World War II. You know, and the detonation of the nuclear bomb we just saw here at Hiroshima, it was detonated to stop the Red Army jointly along with the other allied powers, the imperialist powers, Britain and America, coming to occupy Japan. Otherwise, Japan would have been half socialist, half capitalist. You know, India was very close to having a socialist revolution. Certainly, if they'd been left to themselves, Greece would have had a socialist revolution. Italy would have had a socialist revolution. France was likely to have a socialist revolution. When they liberated themselves from Nazi occupation at the end of World War II, it was the deliberate intervention of America, their use of mafiosi in some areas, their use of the Marshall Plan, their bribery, they're telling the working class of Britain, for example, you don't have to have a revolution, we'll do it for you. We'll give you education, we'll give you the NHS. But once they've worked to undermine socialism all across the globe, once they've undermined our class consciousness, once they've defeated the miners, once they've defeated our union movement, once we don't have class consciousness, what happens? They take it all away again, bit by bit. So we have gone backwards, not because there's been a counter-revolution, the capitalists took power again. No, they lulled us into this false state of assurance that we didn't have to, that we just had to be good boys, do as we were told, and they'd keep on looking after us and don't worry about it. And don't worry about the fact that we're waging wars over there or exploiting them, or we're gradually cutting down your paying conditions. And suddenly look where we find ourselves. Absolutely defeated with classical poverty, crisis going on everywhere. So, you know, real state of depression. And so it's leading us back. It's leading us back to the question of, you know, can we just wait for someone like Robert Owen, a benevolent capitalist, to say, take pity on us, the coalition of the benevolent billionaires, to say, you know what, you should tax us a bit more and give them a few more crumbs? Or do we actually have to say, you know what, we're not begging. It's demeaning to beg. You know, I don't, you know, think, you know, I feel sorry for people when I see them in the street, and sometimes I give them money and sometimes I don't, depending on whether I have any. But it's not going to be, I know when I give them money, though I feel sorry for them, it's not going to be the solution to their problems, you know. It's not going to be, because they're deprived of housing, they're deprived of the means of work, they're deprived of education, they're deprived of all the wherewithal to have a normal, even working class life. And I can't, as an individual, give it to them. When someone comes to the hospital and they have problems with drugs, and I sew up their arteries and I make them well and I send them back into the community without a job, without any sense of hope, you know, without sorting out their social issues, without sorting their housing, I know what's going to happen. I'll see them again. So what we're having to look at is the underlying social problems, to say, you can't just carry on as we are with more and more wealth going to fewer hands and think that Bill Gates, out of the benevolence of his heart, because he likes, you know, giving money to the World Health Organization, that everything will be all right. The working class have to be in a position to reorganize society in their own interests. It's the only stable and lasting way to do it. And there isn't a shortcut. The only way is by having a party, by having an education, lifelong education, but directed at liberation of working people, directed at putting forward class consciousness, directed at bringing more people into our movement. And the Workers' Party has to be that. We have to give a wider education. We have to bring people together. And we have to say, this is not begging. Socialism is not begging. Socialism is not because you're unsuccessful. Socialism is a recognition that society can't carry on as it is. Socialism is a recognition that all of the problems in society today, from war to famine to environmental destruction, they all stem from the fact that 8 people have as much wealth and say in what happens as half the planet's population. It's fundamentally wrong. You can't talk about democracy. It doesn't exist while there are a handful of billionaires who have access to every lever of power and say what actually happens. We've got no say over production. We can't solve the environmental crisis. We don't control production. The people who control production have to make profit. They're only ever going to put a solution in place which makes profit. They think they can always buy themselves out. We have to say no. It's come to the point where we, as the working class who create all wealth, have to actually plan society rationally to meet the needs of humanity. And how do you do it? I don't know. There's no other way than this. Okay, so there is no better way. So education absolutely is key. Education, but it's urgent. It's an urgent education. It's an urgent understanding. So we have to have, you know, practical education for the massive working people. We're going to have actions. We're going to have to get on, not just a demonstration around the NHS, but wherever workers are in struggle, and let them realize that their interests are to be with us and our interests to be with them. We're not doing this to prey upon them. We are the workers. We have the message that's going to help them to liberate themselves and better their lives. And it starts with fighting for better pay and conditions, but it goes far beyond that. It goes to reorganizing political power and making them the ruling class. There's no other solution to humanity's problems. We have to support each other's struggles. We have to come together. We have to create a broad movement, but with a working class leadership that plans to put the working class actually in power, not begging from the rich man, but actually saying, you know, we're going to rule for all.
Thanks very much, Ranjeet. We're almost to the end of the evening now, but I'm just going to ask Christina to make a contribution, because I see that she had a question.
It comes after this wonderful kind of summary and take it forward that Ranjeet just did. All I wanted to say is that there are so many theories about the end of the working class, and yet there are over 30 million people working in this country, and the majority of them are working class. We are the working class, and that's not counting the reserve army of the unemployed, right? So you will have many apologists of the bourgeoisie and many opportunists who will say that, you know, because of the new scientific achievements and the new technologies in production, magically, automatically, we are transitioning to a post-capitalist society. And this education we are receiving tonight is for us to realize the lies, to realize that we have to put the words working class and working class struggle back into the vocabulary of the everyday struggle of our lives. And we have to say to their face that this post-industrial society theory is rubbish, because even when you have a different technological level of the means of production, that doesn't automatically change the relations of productions, which is exploitative, which is exactly what we are targeting. So you can very well have a society that is using the technologies that we are using, that's advanced communication, allow us to be together despite the lockdown, despite the pandemic, but it is in the hands of the few, and we need to change that. And this method, it's about our identity, scientific method that allows us to see through the ages that this world is a product of struggle. It's not a metaphysical concept, it's not an idea. It's for us to write our story. And it's the only way. That's why they are depriving us of this education. This is why we don't have a sense of our working class common struggle, because first we have lost all the environment, you know, the factories, the living together. And secondly, because they are these theories that have taken over academia and anthropology and all these fields that do not study history the way we do here, but promote a very idealistic idea about how society works. All I wanted to say is that there is going to be, in reality, the working class doesn't shrink, the working class doesn't disappear. On the contrary, it expands because the social character of work deepens. And we have to move forward with this technological advancement that we see, and we need to change the character of the relations with the means of production. The working class is us, and we are not abstracted, we are not imagined, we are the main and growing productive force, and we should take heart from this. It is us creating the wealth. And at the same time, we have to be aware of our identity as the exploited of this system. We are the workers who are forced to live by selling our labor. We are deprived of the means of production and subsistence. We are paid in the form of wages and salaries. This hasn't changed. So whatever they sell you as progress because of technology, it hasn't changed our positions and our precarity. It has actually worsened it. And we are the ones who are one paycheck away from homelessness and hunger. And this is what this pandemic reminds us. And yes, we do not ignore that there is stratification in around the working class. People realize that we are more fragmented than ever. Some people feel that because they have some shares in a company, that they are in it together, but they are not. The difficulties that it creates in our workers' consciousness are obstacles that we will fight by emphasizing our unity, like we do in this party. We will fight them. We need to become subjects of our own history. Otherwise, we will forever be subjected to the history of exploitation that is always written by the ruling classes, and we will be subjected to the horrors of imperialist wars. We don't want this history to repeat itself. Through education, we are learning to prevent that.
Thank you, Christina. Excellent contribution. Well, we've gotten to 9:30 now. So, Ranjeet, if you'd like to make any closing remarks, then please do, and I will finish the meeting.
I'll be real brief. So really just thank you to everyone for coming and participating. I've kind of thought about and studied this material and this phenomena for perhaps 30 years, since I was quite young, bit older than him. Many of you may be really familiar with it. Many of you may know more and different aspects of it than I do. Others of you may be coming at this for the first time. And I want you to encourage you to plow this furrow. Please come back and join us. Please get involved with the Workers' Party if you're not already. This country has a rich revolutionary history which is hidden from the workers themselves. This country has a rich socialist history which is hidden from the workers ourselves. Our demands are very moderate, and they've been made by workers up and down this country, of all kinds, of all origins, whether they're English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, immigrant Jamaicans like Claudia Jones, who founded the Notting Hill Carnival, was a scientific socialist. You know, you can go on and on and on. People, the working people, have a rich tradition and history in this country of resistance. We need to really refound that. The Workers' Party is the basis of us doing it. If you're peripherally involved or watching from the outside, please come and get involved. That's mostly what I want to say. I hope you've not found it too boring. I find the study of history amazingly powerful and an amazing justification for knowing that we're on the right track, and that what we're doing is totally reasonable. It's totally justified by science, by the heights of human knowledge, and that we should help the working class to gain this understanding. Not all of the working class will gain it through these lectures or these meetings or these readings. We have to be there. We have to be present with them in their struggle. I'm really happy again to come back where we started, that so many of us were able to get to, I think, 25 or 30 different meetings up and down the country of workers in struggle. That's the NHS struggling for their increased pay. We've got to say that's not a selfish demand. That's the demand of survival for the working class. And it's without fighting for a right to fair existence, for not fair existence, for decent conditions of existence in this crucial time, we're never going to develop the class solidarity necessary to assert ourselves as a ruling class and to take our movement forward. We're never going to take our message to wider groups of people unless we are practically involved on the streets with workers in struggle. So we must continue to do that. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you'll come back for our next couple of sessions where we're going to be looking at the mechanisms of capitalist exploitation and just how true it is to say that our labor creates all wealth. We feed the capitalists, they don't feed us. That they literally rob society. If they're as rich as the whole of humanity, it's because they've robbed the whole of humanity. And we're going to look at the mechanism by which they do it and the mechanism by which we can change it and build that different world. So please keep on coming back. Please share this lecture. It will be available at this meeting, all of your contributions and the theme of the topic, which is not mine, but is the work of great scientific socialist thinkers. I'm just summarizing it and sharing it with you. And I hope that we can continue spreading this learning and understanding together. And very lastly, say well done again to George and Gatry, and congratulations to them on the birth of Oban. And we look forward to having them back with us. I hope they're watching with us. And we wish them well. And we wish the party well in its development for the sake of a strong working class movement that can really start to solve, not just complain about, but really solve the problems that we face every day in our lives and throughout the world. So greetings to you all.
Thanks very much, Ranjeet. Good night, everyone.